Foundations of Jurisprudence. Volume 1. The Architecture of Authority. Chapter 1. The Location of Power. Every legal system begins with a simple structural fact: someone or something must hold the capacity to make decisions that bind the rest of the system. Before rules can exist, before institutions can function, and before obligations can attach, there must be a recognized source of authority. Without that source, nothing else in the system can operate. Authority is not a matter of style or tradition. It is the structural condition that allows a system to act. A rule has force only because the system accepts the authority behind it. A judgment carries weight only because the system recognizes the institution that issued it. Authority is the foundation that supports every other component of the legal architecture. Power and authority are not identical. Power is the ability to act. Authority is the accepted capacity to act within a system. A person may have power without authority, or authority without power, but a legal system requires both to function. Authority is relational. It exists only when the system acknowledges a source as capable of producing binding outcomes. Everything that follows in a legal system depends on this first condition. Jurisdiction, personhood, rights, duties, institutions, enforcement, and remedies all operate within the boundaries authority creates. Once authority is established, the rest of the structure can take shape. Chapter 2. Sovereignty as a structural component. Every legal system requires a point where rulemaking begins. This point is not symbolic or ceremonial. It is the structural source from which the system draws its capacity to create, modify, and maintain the rules that govern everyone within its reach. That source is sovereignty. Sovereignty is the system's highest form of authority. It is the position that holds the exclusive capacity to establish rules that bind the entire environment. Without sovereignty, rule creation would scatter across competing sources, and the system would lose coherence. With sovereignty, the system gains a stable center from which all other components can operate. Sovereignty is not defined by personality or preference. It is defined by structure. A sovereign may be a single institution, a collection of institutions, or a framework established through long-standing practice. What matters is not the form it takes, but the role it performs. The sovereign is the entity the system recognizes as having the final say in creating the rules that shape the environment. This position is exclusive. Only the sovereign may create rules that apply to the entire system. Subordinate institutions may create rules, but only through authority delegated to them. Their power is not independent. It flows from the sovereign and remains limited by the boundaries the sovereign establishes. This hierarchy prevents fragmentation and ensures that the system speaks with one voice when it creates obligations. Sovereignty also defines the scope of the system. It determines where rules apply, who is subject to them, and which institutions may enforce them. These boundaries are not abstract. They are practical limits that shape how the system functions. A rule has meaning only within the space where the sovereign's authority is recognized. For sovereignty to operate, it must have the capacity to support the rules it creates. This includes the ability to administer institutions, maintain procedures, and enforce outcomes. A sovereign without the means to carry out its decisions cannot maintain its position. Structural authority depends on operational capacity. Sovereignty is the anchor of the legal architecture. Every other component, jurisdiction, personhood, rights, duties, institutions, enforcement, and remedies, depends on the existence of a recognized source of rule-making authority. Once sovereignty is established, the rest of the system can take shape around it. Chapter 3. Territorial Jurisdiction. Every legal system operates within a defined space. This space is not symbolic. It is the geographic boundary within which the system's authority is recognized and its rules can be enforced. Territorial jurisdiction gives the system a physical location. Without it, authority would have no clear reach and obligations would have no reliable place to attach. Territory establishes the limits of the system's power. It identifies where rules apply, who is subject to them, and which institutions may act. These boundaries are practical. They determine where enforcement can occur, where remedies can be imposed, and where institutions may carry out their responsibilities. A rule has meaning only within the space where the system's authority is accepted. Jurisdiction is not simply a map. It is a structural condition. A system cannot enforce its rules outside the territory in which its authority is recognized. Enforcement requires a connection between the system and the space in which the action takes place. Without that connection, the system has no standing to intervene. Jurisdiction provides that connection. Territorial boundaries also create predictability. Individuals and institutions know which rules apply in a given space and which authority governs their actions. This clarity allows obligations to attach consistently and allows rights to be exercised with confidence. A stable territorial boundary supports stable expectations. In many environments, territorial jurisdiction is layered. Multiple systems may operate within the same geographic space, each with its own defined scope. These layers do not necessarily conflict. They represent different levels of authority, each responsible for specific functions. A person may be subject to national rules, regional rules, and local rules at the same time, each operating within its designated area. Territorial jurisdiction provides the spatial framework for the entire legal architecture. Authority, personhood, rights, duties, institutions, enforcement, and remedies all depend on the existence of a defined space in which the system can operate. Once territory is established, the system gains the structure it needs to function reliably. Chapter 4. The legal person as a structural entity. A legal system cannot function without a way to recognize the individuals and entities that operate within it. This recognition is not personal. It does not describe character, identity, or individuality. It is a structural status that allows the system to interact with an actor in a consistent and predictable way. This status is legal personhood. A legal person is any actor the system acknowledges as capable of holding rights, bearing duties, entering obligations, and being subject to enforcement. This category includes natural persons, organizations, institutions, and other entities the system chooses to recognize. What matters is not the form of the actor, but the system's decision to treat that actor as a participant in its processes. Recognition is the point at which the system establishes this status. Without recognition, an actor cannot reliably be bound by rules or protected by them. Recognition allows the system to attach obligations, grant permissions, and administer remedies. It also allows institutions to track actions, resolve disputes, and enforce outcomes. Recognition is the structural doorway through which an actor enters the legal environment. Legal identity is the set of attributes the system uses to distinguish one legal person from another. These attributes are administrative tools. They allow institutions to connect actions to the correct actor, maintain records, and ensure that obligations follow the entity responsible for them. Identity is not a personal description. It is a functional requirement. Personhood is maintained through administrative processes such as registration, documentation, and classification. These processes create visibility. Visibility allows the system to monitor participation, enforce duties, and apply remedies. Without visibility, the system cannot reliably interact with an actor. A person who is not visible to the system cannot be fully integrated into its structure. The legal person is therefore a structural entity. It is the point where the system connects rules to actors, obligations to conduct, and remedies to outcomes. Once personhood is established, the system gains the ability to operate consistently across all of its components. Chapter 5. Identity, Registration, and Traceability. A legal system must be able to distinguish one participant from another. This distinction is not personal. It does not describe character, personality, or private identity. It is an administrative requirement that allows the system to connect actions, obligations, and outcomes to the correct actor. This requirement is met through identification. Identification provides the system with a stable way to recognize a legal person. It allows institutions to determine who is responsible for an action, who holds a right, who bears a duty, and who is entitled to a remedy. Without identification, the system cannot reliably attach obligations or administer outcomes. Identification is the structural link between an actor and the rules that apply to them. Registration is the process through which identification becomes operational. It is the point at which a legal person is entered into the system's administrative framework. Registration creates a record. That record allows institutions to track participation, maintain continuity, and ensure that obligations follow the correct actor. Registration is not optional for a functioning system. It is the mechanism that makes visibility possible. Visibility is the system's ability to observe and understand how a legal person interacts with its processes. Visibility does not imply surveillance. It is the structural condition that allows the system to maintain order, enforce duties, and administer remedies. Without visibility, the system cannot reliably determine who acted, what occurred, or how obligations should attach. Traceability extends visibility across time and across institutional processes. It allows the system to follow the path of an action, obligation, or status as it moves through different components of the architecture. Traceability ensures that obligations remain connected to the correct actor, even when circumstances change. It also ensures that institutions can coordinate their actions without losing continuity. Identity, registration, and traceability form a single structural chain. Identity distinguishes the actor. Registration integrates the actor into the system. Traceability maintains the connection between the actor and their obligations. Together, these components allow the legal architecture to function with consistency and reliability. Chapter 6. Rights as Structural Permissions. A legal system must define what a legal person is allowed to do. These allowances are not informal expectations or personal freedoms. They are structural permissions the system recognizes, protects, and enforces. These permissions are rights. A right exists when the system grants a legal person the capacity to act in a specific way or to receive a specific protection. This capacity is not symbolic. It is supported by institutions, procedures, and enforcement mechanisms. A right has meaning only when the system is prepared to uphold it. Rights do not exist independently of the system that defines them. They require a sovereign to establish them, institutions to administer them, and processes to enforce them. A right must be supported by the architecture of the system. Without that support, it becomes a statement rather than an operational permission. Rights operate within a hierarchy. Some rights take precedence over others, and the system must determine how conflicts are resolved. This hierarchy is not arbitrary. It reflects the structure of authority and the priorities the system has established. When rights conflict, the system relies on this hierarchy to determine which right governs the situation. Rights are limited by the boundaries of the system. They apply only within the territory where the system's authority is recognized. They also depend on institutional capacity. A right that cannot be enforced is incomplete. The system must have the means to protect the rights it creates. Rights also interact with duties. A right granted to one person may impose a duty on another. These interactions are part of the system's balance. Rights define what a person may do. Duties define what a person must do. Together, they create the conditions for predictable behavior within the legal environment. Rights are structural permissions. They are the system's way of defining and protecting the capacities it considers essential for participation. Once rights are established, the system gains a framework for guiding conduct, resolving disputes, and maintaining order. Chapter 7. Duties as Structural Obligations. A legal system must define not only what a person may do, but what a person must do. These requirements are not personal expectations or moral preferences. They are structural obligations the system imposes on legal persons to maintain order, allocate responsibilities, and support predictable behavior. These obligations are duties. A duty exists when the system requires a legal person to act in a specific way or to refrain from certain conduct. This requirement is not optional. It is supported by the system's authority and enforced through its institutions. A duty has meaning only when the system is prepared to respond if the obligation is not met. Duties originate from the system's authority. They do not depend on individual agreement or personal consent. Once a legal person is recognized by the system, certain duties attach automatically. These duties may arise from statutes, regulations, institutional processes, or participation in specific activities. The source may vary, but the obligation remains binding. Obligations attach through structural mechanisms. Jurisdiction determines where a duty applies. Registration identifies who the duty applies to. Participation in regulated activities may create additional duties. Institutional processes may impose procedural obligations. These mechanisms ensure that duties attach consistently and predictably. Duties contribute to the stability of the system. They create expectations that guide behavior and allow institutions to function. Without duties, the system would lack the structure needed to enforce rules, administer remedies, or coordinate actions across different components. Duties provide the framework that supports reliable interaction. Duties also interact with rights. A right granted to one person may impose a duty on another. These interactions are part of the system's balance. Rights define what a person may do. Duties define what a person must do. Together, they create the conditions for orderly participation in the legal environment. Duties are structural obligations. They are the system's way of defining the responsibilities necessary for its operation. Once duties are established, the system gains the ability to maintain order, enforce expectations, and support the rights it recognizes. Chapter 8: The Architecture of Liability. A legal system must have a way to respond when obligations are not met. This response is not personal. It is not based on emotion, intention, or moral judgment. It is a structural process that determines how the system addresses conduct that falls outside the boundaries it has established. This process is liability. Liability is the condition that arises when a legal person fails to meet a duty the system has imposed. It connects an unmet obligation to a consequence the system is prepared to enforce. This connection is not optional. It is the mechanism that allows the system to maintain order, protect rights, and ensure that duties have practical meaning. For liability to function, the system must be able to identify the actor responsible for the conduct. This requires recognition, registration, and traceability. Without these components, the system cannot reliably determine who should bear the consequence. Liability depends on the system's ability to connect actions to the correct legal person. Liability also requires a clear definition of the duty that was not met. A system cannot impose consequences for obligations it has not established. Duties must be identifiable, understandable, and consistently applied. When a duty is clear, the system can determine whether it was fulfilled, neglected, or violated. Once responsibility and the unmet duty are established, the system must determine the appropriate consequence. This consequence may take different forms depending on the structure of the system. It may involve compensation, correction, restriction, or another form of remedy. The purpose is not punishment for its own sake. The purpose is to restore order, address harm, or reinforce the expectations the system has created. Institutions play a central role in administering liability. They investigate conduct, interpret rules, apply procedures, and enforce outcomes. Their actions must be consistent with the authority granted to them. Institutional reliability ensures that liability is applied fairly and predictably. Without reliable institutions, liability becomes uncertain and the system loses stability. Liability is the structural response to unmet obligations. It ensures that duties have weight, that rights are protected, and that the system can maintain order. Once liability is established, the legal architecture gains the ability to address conduct that disrupts its processes and to reinforce the expectations that support its operation. Chapter 9: Institutional Authority. Every legal system requires mechanisms that carry out the work of authority. These mechanisms are institutions. They do not possess independent power. Their capacity to act comes entirely from the authority delegated to them. Institutions are the operational extensions of sovereignty. They administer rules, resolve disputes, enforce obligations, maintain records, regulate conduct, and implement procedures. Through these functions, they convert the system's structural authority into practical action. Courts, agencies, and legislatures each perform distinct roles within this architecture. Courts interpret rules, resolve disputes, and administer remedies. Their function is adjudicative, grounded in procedure and interpretation. Agencies implement and enforce regulatory frameworks. Their function is administrative, focused on applying rules to specific environments. Legislatures create rules within the boundaries sovereignty establishes. Their function is generative, shaping the structure within which all other institutions operate. Although their roles differ, none of these institutions stands outside the hierarchy that defines their authority. Each institution operates within a defined domain. This domain is its competence. Competence is not a measure of expertise. It is a structural boundary that determines which matters an institution may address, which procedures it may use, which remedies it may administer, and which obligations it may enforce. When an institution acts outside its competence, its actions lack structural authority. Competence ensures that institutional behavior remains aligned with the system's architecture. Institutions do not function in isolation. They form an interdependent network that supports the system's overall operation. They share records, coordinate enforcement, follow procedural pathways, operate under hierarchical review, and exercise delegated authority. This interdependence ensures continuity across institutional processes. A decision made in one part of the system can be recognized, enforced, or reviewed in another because the institutions operate within a unified structure. Institutions provide the infrastructure through which authority becomes operational. They ensure consistent application of rules, reliable enforcement, predictable outcomes, administrative stability, and structural coherence. Without institutions, sovereignty would have no means to act. Authority would exist in theory, but not in practice. Institutions transform authority into a functioning system. Chapter 10: Enforcement Mechanisms. A legal system must have a way to ensure that its rules, duties, and obligations are followed. This function is enforcement. Enforcement is not inherently punitive. It is the structural process through which the system maintains coherence and stability. Enforcement occurs when the system identifies a breach, determines the obligation that applies, selects a consequence defined by its rules, and uses institutional mechanisms to carry out that consequence. Without enforcement, rules would lack operational force. Enforcement mechanisms take different forms. Some rely on coercive power. These mechanisms use or threaten state authority to ensure compliance. Penalties, restrictions, compulsory actions, and institutional intervention fall into this category. Other mechanisms are non-coercive. They rely on incentives, administrative processes, or procedural requirements. Registration systems, reporting obligations, administrative corrections, and procedural compliance are examples. Both forms of enforcement support predictable behavior and maintain structural stability. Enforcement depends on resource capacity. Institutions require personnel, infrastructure, procedures, and operational tools to carry out enforcement. These resources determine how often enforcement occurs, how broad its reach can be, how reliably it can be applied, and how effectively the system can respond to breaches. Enforcement is shaped not only by legal rules, but also by the practical limits of institutional capacity. Enforcement maintains the system by ensuring that obligations are fulfilled and breaches addressed. It supports institutional credibility, stabilizes expectations, reinforces obligations, and preserves the continuity of legal processes. Without enforcement, obligations would weaken, remedies would lose meaning, and institutional authority would erode. Enforcement is woven into the system's architecture. Legitimacy in enforcement arises when the system applies consequences consistently, predictably, and within procedural and jurisdictional boundaries. Structural legitimacy does not depend on public approval. It depends on conformity to the system's architecture. When enforcement aligns with institutional competence and jurisdiction, the system maintains coherence and authority. Chapter 11. Remedies as Structural Responses. A legal system must have a way to address breaches, resolve disputes, and restore order. These responses are remedies. Remedies are not personal judgments or moral evaluations. They are structural mechanisms designed to correct deviations from the system's requirements. A remedy exists when the system identifies a breach or dispute, determines the consequence that applies, implements a corrective measure, and restores structural balance. Remedies preserve the operational force of obligations. Remedies take different forms depending on the function they serve. Some remedies are corrective. They restore the status that existed before the breach and address structural imbalance. Others are compensatory. They provide measurable redress for loss or harm and address structural deficiency. Declaratory remedies clarify rights, duties, or legal relationships and address structural uncertainty. Preventive remedies guide or restrict future conduct and address structural risk. Each type of remedy operates within institutional boundaries and according to the system's hierarchy. Remedies are administered through institutional pathways. These pathways ensure that remedies are procedurally grounded, jurisdictionally valid, consistent with institutional competence, and aligned with the system's hierarchy. Courts, administrative agencies, regulatory bodies, and specialized tribunals may each administer remedies depending on the nature of the dispute. The pathway determines the form, scope, and enforceability of the remedy. Remedies contribute to system stability. They resolve disputes, correct breaches, reinforce obligations, maintain predictability, and support institutional legitimacy. Without remedies, obligations would lose meaning, enforcement would become arbitrary, and institutional authority would weaken. Remedies ensure that the system can respond to disruption in a structured and predictable way. A remedy provides closure to a legal process. Closure marks the completion of an institutional pathway and the restoration of system balance. It ensures finality, maintains continuity of records, supports enforceability, and stabilizes legal relationships. Remedies transform disputes and breaches into resolved outcomes, allowing the system to maintain coherence across time. Chapter 12. Procedural Pathways. Institutions cannot act arbitrarily. They must follow defined sequences that guide how authority is exercised. These sequences are procedural pathways. Procedures ensure consistency, predictability, and legitimacy. A procedural pathway exists when the system defines a series of steps, assigns institutional roles, establishes timing and order, specifies required actions, and determines the conditions for completion. Procedures convert authority into operational processes. Procedural boundaries define the limits within which institutions must operate. They ensure that actions remain jurisdictionally valid, institutionally competent, structurally consistent, and procedurally grounded. Boundaries prevent institutions from acting prematurely, acting without authority, skipping required steps, or imposing unauthorized consequences. These limits preserve the integrity of institutional processes. Procedural pathways create structural rights and obligations for legal persons. Procedural rights include notice, the opportunity to respond, access to institutional processes, defined timelines, and mechanisms for review. Procedural obligations include compliance with deadlines, submission of required information, adherence to institutional rules, and participation in mandated processes. These rights and obligations ensure consistent procedural performance across the system. Procedural continuity ensures that institutional processes remain stable across time and circumstances. Continuity is maintained through standardized forms, uniform procedures, consistent institutional practices, predictable timelines, and established review mechanisms. This stability ensures that outcomes are determined by structure rather than variability. Procedural closure marks the completion of a pathway. Closure signifies that all required steps have been completed, institutional authority has been exercised, a final outcome has been reached, and the matter is ready for enforcement or recordation. Closure provides finality and prevents processes from remaining open indefinitely. Chapter 13: Evidence as Structural Input. A legal system must have a way to evaluate claims, resolve disputes, and determine whether obligations have been met or breached. This evaluation depends on evidence. Evidence is the information the system recognizes as relevant to an institutional process. It becomes evidence when the system identifies it, determines its relevance, evaluates its reliability, and integrates it into a procedural pathway. Evidence provides the informational foundation for institutional decision-making. Relevance is the filter that determines whether information qualifies as evidence. Information is relevant when it has a logical connection to a fact, obligation, or condition the system must evaluate. Relevance ensures focused processes, efficient pathways, outcomes grounded in system-defined criteria, and decisions based on structurally meaningful information. Information that lacks relevance is excluded because it does not contribute to the system's evaluation. Reliability refers to the degree to which evidence meets institutional standards for accuracy, consistency, and trustworthiness. Reliability is assessed through procedural rules, institutional practices, criteria for admissibility, and mechanisms for verification. Reliable evidence supports stable and predictable outcomes. Without reliability, institutional decisions would lose structural legitimacy. Evidence shapes institutional outcomes as it moves through procedural pathways. It determines whether obligations have been fulfilled, whether duties have been breached, whether remedies are appropriate, and whether enforcement is justified. Evidence functions within the procedural architecture, guided by rules governing its collection, presentation, evaluation, and recordation. Institutional decisions rely on evidence to maintain structural legitimacy. Decisions must be grounded in relevant information, supported by reliable inputs, consistent with procedural rules, and aligned with institutional competence. Without evidence, institutional actions would lack justification and the system would lose coherence. Chapter 14: Interpretation as Structural Process. A legal system cannot function unless its rules have meaning. That meaning does not arise automatically from the text. It is produced through interpretation. Interpretation is the structural process through which institutions determine how rules apply, how they interact with other components of the system, and how they operate within the environment authority creates. Interpretation is not a creative act. It is an institutional function that ensures rules remain consistent with the architecture of the system. Interpretation begins when an institution identifies a rule and examines the structural context in which it exists. Rules do not stand alone. They derive meaning from the hierarchy that supports them. Constitutional authority shapes statutory meaning. Statutory meaning shapes regulatory frameworks. Institutional precedents and procedural requirements further refine how rules operate. Interpretation aligns each rule with the structure that gives it force. Institutions use defined methods to interpret rules. These methods are not matters of preference. They are tools the system provides to ensure consistency. Textual analysis examines the language of the rule. Contextual analysis situates the rule within its structural environment. Hierarchical analysis aligns the rule with higher-level authority. Purpose-based analysis identifies the function the rule serves within the system. These methods ensure that interpretation remains grounded in structure rather than individual discretion. Only institutions with the proper competence may interpret rules. Competence determines which rules an institution may interpret, the scope of its interpretive authority, the the binding effect of its interpretations, and the mechanisms through which those interpretations may be reviewed. When an institution interprets a rule outside its competence, the interpretation lacks structural legitimacy. Competence ensures that interpretive authority remains aligned with the system's architecture. Interpretation maintains coherence across the system. It resolves ambiguity, aligns rules with authority, ensures consistent application, integrates new rules into existing structures, and prevents conflict between components. Through interpretation, the system preserves stability and predictability. Rules become operational not because they exist, but because institutions interpret them in ways that maintain structural unity. Chapter 15. The Hierarchy of Norms. A legal system contains many types of rules, principles, and standards. These elements do not operate on the same level. They exist within a hierarchy that determines their scope, priority, and application. This hierarchy is essential to the system's coherence. Without it, rules would conflict, institutions would diverge, and obligations would lose stability. Norms function structurally when they define a rule or standard, operate within a specific domain, derive authority from a higher source, and can be enforced through institutional mechanisms. The hierarchy begins with constitutional norms. These norms establish the foundational structure of authority and define the limits of institutional power. Below them are statutory norms, created by the legislature within constitutional boundaries. Statutory norms define obligations, rights, and institutional functions. Regulatory norms operate beneath statutory norms. They are created by administrative agencies under delegated authority. Their purpose is to operationalize statutory requirements. Local or subjurisdictional norms govern specific geographic or institutional domains. They must align with higher-level norms. Institutional norms, procedural rules, internal guidelines, and operational standards form the lowest level of the hierarchy. They ensure consistent performance within institutions. When norms conflict, the hierarchy determines which norm prevails. Conflict resolution is structural, not discretionary. Higher-level authority overrides lower-level authority. Norms are interpreted within their structural context. Norms that exceed delegated power are invalid. When possible, norms are harmonized to preserve coherence. The hierarchy prevents lower-level norms from undermining higher-level authority. Delegation is the mechanism through which authority flows downward. Lower-level norms exist only because higher-level authority grants the power to create them. Delegation determines the scope of rulemaking power, the limits of institutional authority, the validity of subordinate norms, and the mechanisms for review. A norm created without proper delegation lacks structural legitimacy. The hierarchy of norms is a foundational component of the legal architecture. It ensures coherence across institutions, predictability of outcomes, stability of obligations, consistency of enforcement, and alignment with sovereign authority. Without a hierarchy, the system would fragment into conflicting rules and inconsistent practices. The hierarchy provides the structure that allows the system to function as a unified whole. Chapter 16. Integration of system components. A legal system is not a collection of isolated parts. It is a unified architecture in which authority, institutions, procedures, rights, duties, evidence, remedies, and enforcement operate as interconnected components. Integration ensures that each component functions in relation to the others, producing a coherent and predictable system. Without integration, the system would lose stability and drift into inconsistency. Integration occurs when authority flows through institutions. Institutions apply procedures. Procedures generate outcomes. Outcomes enforce rights and duties. Rights and duties shape conduct, and conduct triggers institutional responses. These interactions form a continuous cycle. The system operates not as a series of disconnected events, but as a coordinated structure. Vertical integration aligns components across hierarchical levels. Constitutional authority guides statutory rules. Statutory rules guide regulatory frameworks. Regulatory frameworks guide institutional processes. Institutional processes guide individual outcomes. Vertical integration ensures that lower-level components remain aligned with higher-level authority. Horizontal integration coordinates components across institutions operating at the same level. Courts, agencies, and administrative bodies apply consistent standards. Procedural pathways align across institutions. Enforcement mechanisms operate uniformly. Remedies remain compatible across domains. Horizontal integration prevents institutional divergence and maintains uniformity across the system. Functional integration ensures that each component performs its role in relation to the others. Authority establishes the environment. Jurisdiction defines the space. Personhood identifies the actors. Rights and duties shape conduct. Procedures guide institutional action. Evidence informs decisions. Remedies restore balance. Enforcement maintains order. Functional integration ensures that the system operates as a single mechanism rather than as independent parts. Integration produces stability. Authority is exercised consistently. Institutions operate predictably. Procedures produce reliable outcomes. Rights and duties remain enforceable. Remedies restore balance. Enforcement maintains order. Stability is the natural result of integrated components functioning within a coherent architecture. Chapter 17: System Coherence and Structural Unity. A legal system must operate coherently to maintain authority and stability. Coherence is the condition in which all components of the system function in alignment. It is not an abstract ideal. It is a structural requirement. A system is coherent when authority flows through defined channels, institutions act within their competence, procedures follow established pathways, rights and duties remain enforceable, remedies restore balance, and enforcement maintains order. Coherence is the outcome of a properly integrated architecture. The system's unity arises from structural alignment rather than shared values. Its purpose is the administration of authority. Unity exists when rules reflect the hierarchy of norms, institutions apply rules consistently, procedures guide institutional action, evidence informs decisions, remedies resolve disputes, and enforcement ensures compliance. Unity is functional, not ideological. The components of the legal system are interdependent. Authority is operationalized through institutions. Institutions rely on procedures. Procedures rely on evidence. Evidence informs decisions. Decisions produce remedies. Remedies require enforcement. No component operates in isolation. This interdependence forms a continuous cycle that maintains system stability. Integrity refers to the system's ability to maintain its structure across time and circumstances. Integrity is preserved when rules remain aligned with authority. Institutions adhere to procedural boundaries, enforcement remains consistent, remedies remain effective, and obligations remain enforceable. Integrity is maintained through continuous structural alignment. Coherence is the foundation of legitimacy. A system is legitimate when it follows its own rules, applies authority consistently, maintains procedural order, produces predictable outcomes, and resolves disputes reliably. Coherence allows the system to sustain authority across time. A coherent system is stable, predictable, and capable of supporting the environment it governs. Unified closing. A legal system begins with authority. It is the condition that allows rules to exist, institutions to function, and obligations to attach. Every component examined in this volume, jurisdiction, personhood, identity, rights, duties, liability, institutions, procedures, evidence, remedies, and enforcement, operates within the structural space authority creates. Authority is not an abstract ideal. It is the architecture that gives the system form. Throughout this volume, authority has been described in neutral, structural terms. It has not been justified or evaluated. Its purpose here is functional. Authority establishes the boundaries within which the system acts. It determines who may create rules, who may interpret them, who may enforce them, and how those actions must occur. Authority defines the environment in which the legal system operates. Once authority is established, the rest of the architecture becomes possible. Institutions gain their competence. Procedures gain their pathways. Rights and duties gain their meaning. Evidence gains its relevance. Remedies gain their force. Enforcement gains its legitimacy. Authority does not operate alone. It supports a network of components that depend on it for coherence and stability. This volume has traced the structure of that environment. It has shown how authority shapes the system's space, how it defines the actors within it, and how it supports the mechanisms that maintain order. But authority is only the beginning. A system does not function solely because authority exists. It functions because authority moves. The next volume examines that movement. Influence is the structural condition that determines how authority flows through institutions, how decisions take shape, and how outcomes emerge. If authority defines the environment, influence defines the dynamics within it. Together, they form the foundation of the system's behavior. Authority provides the structure. Influence provides the motion. With the architecture of authority established, the system is ready to be understood in motion.